Thank you. I want to thank the festival and Tatiana for inviting us. It's really great, and it's actually great to hang out with these guys whose work I love, and to be here. I also want to say before I dive in that for the journalists in the room who think maybe there'll be news broken here tonight, there's not going to be. So, if you want to, go and get a drink or get dinner now, because I'm actually really happy to be talking about sort of more in an art context and my work in that way, and also in the visual medium. So for the past, I guess, 10 years, I've been trying to document the war on terror and to try to understand its emotional and human consequences. And sort of in juxtaposition what Trevor's doing, who's trying to understand techniques of seeing, I'm sort of trying to understand techniques of feeling, or how we can actually understand the consequences of what has happened, what has transpired in the wake of the U.S. response to 9/11. I think one of the things that I struggle with as a filmmaker, as a journalist, and as an artist is how do you translate information that we actually know? So for instance, we know that Guantánamo is still open and that there are people who've been there since January 2002, and they're still there and they've never been charged. So we all know that. But how much time in the last year, in the last 2 years, in the last 5 years, have we actually tried to take any action about that, or actually felt any feeling about that? And so what I try to do is find ways to work with information that's actually not secret. So information like, that the United States legalized torture, we know that. But what happens if you try to get us closer to actually experience it or feeling it? And in all my work, what I try to do is to implicate the audience in some way. So I'm not interested in kind of a passive relationship, but that you're sort of drawn in. You're either perhaps empathizing, you're perhaps recognizing yourself in the position of those who are the perpetrators, and sort of some sort of a spectrum, but that there's not sort of a distance between you and what you're seing. And sort of the techniques that I use are often, using, classic storytelling. Okay, so I'm going to show, and I'm going to be showing some images. So, So we can bring up the audio. I'm going to talk over it, so just bring it in light. So these are images that I shot after 9/11. I live in New York, and I was in New York on 9/11, and I didn't go down there right away, but after a few days I said, okay, I want to understand. And this was after having seen sort of the countless repeats of, the planes flying into the buildings. And I went down there. And I ended up filming the people who were gathering, and feeling that what they were experiencing, and not actually revealing what they were looking at, which was in fact something that didn't exist anymore, was maybe a way to try to understand how we were feeling in that moment as a New Yorker. And looking at these images, I often think that they kind of represent sort of a path not taken. I mean, what we didn't respond to, or because as a New Yorker, there was an incredible amount of empathy and just human connection, and that you could feel. I mean, I think that many of us felt, and sort of not quite knowing what was happening in other rooms who were planning on how to respond to these events. So on September 14th was when the government issued the authorization of the use of military force, which was a vast expansion of executive powers that allowed the Bush administration and now the Obama administration to engage in all kinds of activities without sort of seeking the approval of Congress or the judiciary. On October 7th, so when you're looking at these images, there have been no wars. We haven't started to invade Afghanistan. October 7th is when what's called Operation Enduring Freedom began. in Afghanistan, which was the war in Afghanistan that is still going on today. On October 13th, servers arrived at the NSA under guard to begin the illegal warrantless wiretapping program, which was the program that we now know called Stellar Wind, to spy on Americans or domestic spying, and how the sort of war on terror was sort of turned inward. Again, we didn't know about this. Moving forward after these images, on January 11th, 2002, the first prisoners arrived at Guantánamo Bay prison. In the summer of 2002 is when the Office of Legal Counsel and John Yoo drafted what we know as the torture memos, which they legalized, where they legalized the use of torture, and they did that because they captured people who they tortured, and then they were asked what to do with that, and they said, okay, we have to provide legal guidance, and so they provide legal guidance of what could be defined as torture, and a quote from it. The memo says that physical pain amounting to torture must be equivalent to the intensity to the pain accompanying serious physical injury, such as organ failure, impairment of bodily function, or even death. So what the United States government was defining as torture was, if you were to die or if you were having organ failure, you were being tortured. Everything else, was sort of fair game. And in 2 years after these images were shot, filmed, I guess maybe is a better way to say it, we began the invasion of Iraq, which is a country, as we now know, that had no connection to the events of 9/11, and that we now also know has led to hundreds of thousands of civilian casualties. So that's sort of just a juxtaposition of events that we know that have occurred in connection to these images, which I think represent a kind of innocence. And another thing that I think is quite striking about them, the lack of devices. We see no. I mean, I think if this were today, everybody would be with their cameras and cell phones and taking pictures. Okay. So one of the things that as I was as a New Yorker, I was paying attention to things unfold, and then at some point I realized as a documentarian that I did actually want to engage what was happening and what the United States was doing in the world, and I made the decision that I wanted to document the war in Iraq. And partly that had to do with the fact of being confronted with these daily headlines that represented body counts of Iraqis who were dying on a daily basis. And there was a sort of striking contradiction between the body counts, sort of the US body counts, where the victims are named and counted to the exact number, versus what we were seeing in Iraq, and where these are bodies without names. These are bodies that aren't counted. These are bodies that don't relate to us, and so I felt that it was important to try to understand what that world looked like, or to try to sort of bridge this divide. And this is sort of an example of that. This is the front page of the New York Times. It's sort of low resolution, but you can see it has the image from Abu Ghraib that probably most of us know. This was a story. So this was published in the spring of 2004. In January, the Times also reported on Abu Ghraib. They reported it was deep in the newspaper. It was all in print, and it basically said that there's been an investigation launched within the military about prisoner abuse in Iraq. And it was buried in the news. Nobody picked it up. It was all print. And several months later, because of a whistleblower, Sergeant Darby, who came forward, who had seen these images and struggled with them and brought them forward, and they were leaked to the public. So it's only because of the efforts of a whistleblower that we actually know what the United States government was doing at Abu Ghraib, and we have these images. And there's certainly, I think, there's some of the most horrifying representations of war that sort of we have yet to see. In terms of sort of the way that I work, or the kind of, I guess we talked before we met about like our different types of practice, and we sort of share something in common, is that we all seem to work in a very empirical way. We go into the world and we engage the world, and we try to piece together clues or evidence that we bring back to whatever, translate. I don't make theoretical work. I'm not interested in people who, want to talk about other people's experience. I'm actually interested in what happens when you go into the fields and meet people. In general, my work, the process begins where there's something that I'm interested in documenting. In this case, it was the Iraq War and the sort of human consequences of it, not just for Iraqis, but also for the U.S. Military, who were being basically put in an impossible context to try to both occupy a country and do nation building, and which was an impossible predicament. So I was interested in both those things. And then with that in mind, I traveled. I went to Iraq and sought out, or what I do consistently is that with a certain kind of theme that I'm interested in, find individuals who will let me film them, go on some sort of a journey that will allow me to understand how they are, in a sense, interpreting the environment that they find themselves. So this, when I went to Iraq, became the story of an Iraqi family. So there's this change from sort of a general interest to actual people who are, that I usually film in real time, and then that translates into storytelling, because then I'm usually telling some sort of a narrative that happens over time, and that those narratives are the sort of vehicle through which I sort of try to understand things, and so understand the war in Iraq. But they also, hopefully, if they're successful, operate on the level of storytelling in the sense of larger universal questions, not just the sort of particulars in which I'm filming. So I went to Iraq. I mean, it began, actually the first thing, I had this idea that I was going to do it. I talked to some journalists who'd been in the field, and then they were like, well, it was during the time where Iraq didn't actually exist as a country. It was only occupied, so you couldn't apply for a visa to go to Iraq. There were ways that you could get in. I was interested in documenting also from the military perspective. So somebody gave me an email for the public affairs, and I sent an email to the U.S. military saying that I was interested in documenting their nation building project, which was actually quite true. I was interested in documenting their nation building project. I wasn't very optimistic that it was going to be a successful project, but so I sent that, and then they responded right away, and then we began a talk. And so that was sort of the first access I had, was access to what were called the Civil Affairs Division of the military, and those are people in the military who are in professional roles like lawyers or doctors, who are often reservists, who are brought in. And so they were, I was given permission to document them, and I was going to look at the election process, which I was interested in. So that's how I kind of got on the ground. But then once I got on the ground, I quickly realized that I couldn't make a film just about this sort of U.S. perspective, because the U.S. had built a cage. It had imprisoned itself in the country with walls, and they separated themselves, like they called the inside the wire the green zone, rest of Iraq, like all of it, everyone, is the red zone. And then when they would cross from the green zone to the red zone, it was with 4 Humvees and a whole lot of ammunition, to do nation building. I mean, it was quite staggering. So I realized once I got sort of in Iraq, I was like, okay, this is going to be a problem, because I don't want to replicate this sort of worldview. I want to document it. I want to understand it, and I want to understand how people are trying to sort of grapple with it. I'm not, generally my work isn't about I'm not interested in berating people. I mean, I really want to understand where the predicament that they're put in and how they deal with it. So I got there, but then I was worried, and soon after I arrived it was in May 2004, and the Abu Ghraib photographs had been released. And somebody told me from the military that there was going to be inspection of Abu Ghraib, and this wasn't an inspection that was open to the press. It was an inspection that somebody told me about, and he said, somebody from the military said, you can put in a request. It's going to be really hard to get access, but if you write me an email, I'll try to see if I can help you. So I wrote an email and another email, and sort of moved around, and finally they said, okay, you can come on this trip. So this was a trip of Iraqis who, of course, were horrified by the Abu Ghraib photographs, going to Abu Ghraib for the first time to inspect it. And I was able to go there with a camera, and I'll show a short clip from that.
This is type of punishment. This type of punishment, they can't bear it because they are children.
We have looked through every one of these files. These juveniles are dangerous.
When I did this shoot, this was a situation where I'd been given access to film at Abu Ghraib, and I knew I was going to need someone to film, sort of take me through. And the man that you just saw, his name is Dr. Riyad, was a part of city council, and I asked him if I could follow him that day. And then after we filmed there, I then began documenting his life in Iraq. And so it was not like I didn't have sort of a production schedule and a shoot schedule and a producer who cleared all my access. It would never have happened that way. I mean, there's a lot of just kind of entering into a situation and meeting people and then finding the story somewhat organically. And the story could have been different. If I had not gotten access, I would have made a different film, but it probably would have still tried to reflect some of the same issues in terms of the war and the occupation. So after I finished that film, I wanted to try to do something about Guantánamo. I finished the Iraq film in 2006, and I was quite shocked that Guantánamo was still open. It had, at that point, was 4 years, and shamed. I mean, I think it will be one of the great shames of chapters of American history that we've created a prison, where people are held indefinitely without charge. So it was a question of, okay, so how am I going to tell that story? The largest number of detainees at Guantánamo were and are Yemenis, so I traveled to Yemen. Actually, my first trip was with a lawyer, somebody who represented several detainees, and then began that film. And this is a short clip. This is the protagonist. There are two protagonists in the film. One that you see and you come to know, and the other protagonist is a prisoner, and he's in a sense a ghost in the film. You actually don't get to meet him. And one of the things I was trying to, how do you represent somebody who actually has been disappeared? So this is the short clip. This is the beginning of that film. This is U.S. military shot footage.
كانت تلمس من النوع الواحد واحد خارج كل شيء كفر.
Actually, so that's Salim Hamdan, who was the plaintiff in one of the most well-known Guantanamo cases, which was a Supreme Court victory saying that the military commission process were unconstitutional. And that film was something that actually was shown in court, and I got access to it. But that's the only time you actually see him is during this interrogation. But his letters are narrated throughout the film. And again, it's just how do you actually have not just the information that we know people are in prison, but that we actually have some sort of understanding of their humanity. And I was actually looking at that, I forgot that, so the cinematographer I worked with was an extraordinary, talented woman, Kirsten Johnson. When we started talking, I called her up and I said, hi, I'm going to be shooting in Yemen, and I really need someone to go to Guantanamo and film, but you're not going to have any access. So you're going to be completely shut out from, you're not going to be able to film at the trial, but we want to sort of convey some kind of emotional resonance. And most cinematographers would see that as like a, huge, like, hang up the phone and like not so interested. And she was really excited about that challenge. And she actually on the first phone call referenced Trevor's work. And she said, have you ever seen Trevor Paglen's photographs? And I hadn't, and I did after that. And so in a sense, there's a bit of homage to Trevor's work and that Guantanamo stuff. I made another film about Guantanamo, a short film that I finished a year ago. And the trip that when I was sort of going back and forth and filming, I had filmed with the Red Cross as they were delivering letters to families of prisoners. And fast forward several years later, there was a prisoner who died from Yemen. And I when I read the news, I said, well, I'm sure that I filmed their family. And I had. And so I made a film for last year for the 11th year anniversary of Guantanamo. It was a short film that was shown in the New York Times, and I'm just going to show a bit of it. This is Adnan Latif, who is, you'll see.
He gave me a testament to give to his son. He said, to be strong, to be wise, and to be just.
So. In working on this, people have often asked me, they think that I'm interested in sort of only working in the Middle East, and it's actually not true. What I'm actually interested in making films about the United States, and I feel that all the films that I've made, both in Iraq and Yemen, and currently, are looking at sort of how the U.S. is sort of exerting power internationally. And so what I'm working on now is how the sort of war on terror is happening domestically in the United States and in the West, I guess, through the sort of growth of state surveillance in response to 9/11. Lots of people, it happened immediately. It was one of the first things that happened, that they moved in servers into the NSA to begin the domestic wiretapping program, basically mass suspicionless, warrantless surveillance of entire populations. And which is ongoing, that we know, and thanks to the work of Edward Snowden. I'm going to show the beginning of a short piece that I did on William Binney, who Jake showed a photograph of. This was I did before Snowden's releases and before he contacted me. So I had spent a lot of time as sort of Jake also referenced, that there were a lot of people who were saying, all these things are happening, and didn't, Bill Binney had a lot of personal experience and knowledge and was an eyewitness to the program, but he didn't, he couldn't substantiate it with documents. So last January, I got an email from an anonymous source saying that he actually had evidence of government illegality and NSA abuse and mass surveillance, and it started a long correspondence that was anonymous throughout until early June, where I went to Hong Kong with Glenn Greenwald and met Snowden. This was probably a the piece that probably more people will ever see than any film I ever make. Oh, actually, I'm going to skip. I had two versions of this presentation. So I'm actually going to skip it because I think actually the Snowden has, this actually, sorry guys, I made a last minute change and when I saved it, it obviously didn't save. So that was sort of unfair of me, but I apologize. And at the end, the Utah facility is I've been documenting it since 2011, and it's where all of our emails are going to go. It's kind of, I think, in terms of like, take it, the things that we actually do know about the war on terror and the sort of inside or the secret, we know thanks to the courage of whistleblowers. Sergeant Joe Darby, Chelsea Manning, Edward Snowden, William Benny, Thomas Drake, Kirk Beebe, Edward Loomis, Jesslyn Raddick. I mean, there's a long, long list of people who've really disrupted their lives because they couldn't, in good faith, live with the knowledge that they had without making it public. And I think that sort of the theme of this part of the festival is all about whistleblowers and our thanks to them. So I think, with that, I'm going to hand it back off to Tatiana.